Hi everyone, welcome to Chapter 1, Introducing Interpersonal Communication. In this video, we're going to cover what is communication, what is interpersonal communication, what is interpersonal communication competence, and issues in interpersonal communication. So let's go ahead and get started. So, big question is, what is communication? Communication is a process through which people use messages to generate meanings within and across contexts, cultures, channels, and media. But what does that really mean? So let's break it down. Communication is a process. Sometimes we think of communication as a thing, but communication is actually an activity. Just like with any process, there's certain steps that you have to take, and each step leads you to the next step, until eventually you have a certain result. Communication involves messages and our interactions. So a message is a package of information, some thought that you have that you want to get out there to someone else. An interaction is defined as a series of messages, so a conversation, for example. Then lastly, we have that communication occurs within and across contexts, cultures, channels, and media. So a context is a situation shaping the communication. For example, let's say you go out with a group of friends to a movie. Well, the conversations that you have are probably going to be different than if you have dinner with your dad, or if you're giving a speech in front of a large audience. Because all of those situations are going to be different, therefore the communication is going to be different as well. Then we have cultures. Cultures really boils down to a pattern of traditions and actions that people take who are very similar in background to one another. We'll talk more about that a little bit later. Channels. So channels refers to the ways that we communicate, the nonverbal or verbal means through which we transmit a message. For example, maybe you have a conversation face to face, then that would be your channel. Sometimes we use different media to help us with our channels. And think of media not as social media or the media on TV like mass media, but media as in medium. So it basically boils down to being a tool that aids in communication, such as a cell phone or a newspaper or the radio. Now, some of this should look very familiar to you because you've all had speech communication. So let's go over the components of communication. Sender and receiver. The sender is the person who sends out the message, and the receiver is the one who receives the message. Message, we've covered that, is just the information that you're trying to send out. Channel, we've covered that as well. Then there's our code. So we have a nonverbal code and verbal codes. So each culture has certain nonverbals that they use, and each culture has their own verbal codes, such as a certain language that you use. Then there's feedback. So you can kind of think of feedback as the receiver's message, what they're sending back to the sender to let them know, I understand, I don't understand, or this is how I feel about what you just sent me. Then there's noise, interference. So this is anything that interrupts the communication process, whether that's actually a auditory noise, something that you hear, whether it's something that's a mental noise, maybe a thought that you're having, or maybe you're daydreaming. It can be a semantic noise. So if I say a really big word that you don't know, maybe you stop listening to me and start focusing on, well, what does that word mean? And that would interfere with the communication process. So any type of interference we classify as noise. And this brings us to the different models that we have for communication. So in the beginning, when communication scholars were trying to think about, well, what does communication look like? They came up with the linear communication model, also known as the action communication model. They said that the sender sends a message through a channel to a receiver, and that in all cases there's some type of noise that could interfere with that message. But then scholars got back together and said, well, that doesn't completely give us an overview of what communication really looks like. Which brings us to the interactive communication model. They said the sender receives a message through a channel to the receiver, and then the sender, well, in that case the receiver, sends feedback, their own message back to the original sender. And that in all cases, yes, again, there is still noise. So the interactive model builds upon the linear model in that it adds the process of feedback. Then there's lastly the transactional communication model. This is the most complete version that scholars have come up with. They said that simultaneously we are sending and receiving messages. We are both sender and receiver at the same time. So we are constantly sending messages and sending feedback. It only matters on perspective. So if I am this guy right here, I'm a sender. If I'm this guy right here, I'm a sender. But to the opposite person, that person's a receiver. So no matter what, we are simultaneously sending and receiving messages. And at any point, noise can interfere with that. So to help kind of show what that looks like in a different layout, I have this model as well. Now, you can see person A and person B being both sender and receiver at the same time. There's a context that's going to shape the conversation. There's our channel, there's our code. Messages and feedback are going both ways. And this is also showing the interference of noise. What I like about this picture is that it also adds a frame of reference for each person, which in your book is called the fields of experience. And this is beliefs, attitudes, values, and experiences that shape how we interact with each other. So basically every single thing that's ever happened to you has in some way affected you and is going to continually affect all of your communication from now on. This now brings us to our next big question from this chapter. What is interpersonal communication? Your book defines interpersonal communication as a dynamic form of communication between two or more people in which the messages exchanged significantly influences their thoughts, emotions, behaviors, and relationships. So we're going to break that down. It's dynamic, it's transactional, it's primarily dyadic, and it creates an impact. So let's go through all of those steps. Interpersonal communication is dynamic. Dynamic means that it's constantly changing from moment to moment. There's not a single way that you can repeat a single moment of communication. So it's based on our perceptions, thoughts, moods, and emotions. So we are constantly changing. And with each changing moment, how we minutely change into the different people that we become, our communication is also going to be affected by that. So think of the movie Pocahontas, if you've ever seen that Disney movie. She says at one point, you can't step in the same river twice. Communication is just like that. We cannot step back into the same communication that we just had. Interpersonal communication is transactional. Going back to that transactional model we just covered, we never stop communicating. Communication is always going to be a process that we are constantly involved in. It never ends. As long as someone's there to interpret, there's communication. Additionally, communication is simultaneous. We are both sending and receiving those messages. Interpersonal communication is primarily dyadic. Dyadic meaning that involves two people. Now, interpersonal communication can involve more than two people, but generally is seen as a dyad. Now, that dyad may have an I-thou type of communication or an I-it type of communication. These two terms, I-thou and I-it, are the works of Martin Buber, who was a philosopher. He spent a lot of his time thinking about how people exist. And he eventually came up with the theories that we use I thou and I it in our communication with people. He even expanded it to non-people entities like trees and animals. When we engage in an I thou type of relationship is when we truly acknowledge the other person's existence. We don't see them as some object that exists in our world, but we think about how they have their own world, their own desires, and because we're more considerate of that other person, our communication with that person truly sees them as another entity. Then we have I it. So in an I it situation, that person's just in our way. They're there for a certain reason. Maybe it's that stranger on the bus stop who is annoying you, and you just think, oh, this person needs to go away. But you don't actually acknowledge, well, why is this person even here? Maybe they're on their way to a certain place. That type of thought and having a change in our own processes helps shape the communication that we will have with that person. We can even have an impersonal type of communication if we use not it, where we don't really try to get to know that person. It stays pretty cold. Now, when we think about interpersonal communication being primarily dyadic, we need to think about the fact that this is in contrast to intrapersonal communication, which is communication with the self. As you can see from the I thou not it, all of our communication in some ways will affect us. So our communication will affect the self. But intrapersonal communication is communication that you have only by yourself. Then next we have that there is a content and a relationship dimension. So content refers to the actual words, actual meaning of the words, and relationship refers to the signals indicating a viewpoint. So this is a picture from one of my favorite commercials on TV, where at first you see this man singing some kind of chant, and you don't really know why he's chanting. And then it pans out, and you see his daughter, his adopted daughter, and you understand, well, he's helping her practice. So the content, the actual meaning of the words, seems really silly because he's singing some childlike chant. But then when you look at it from the context of its relationship, it shapes the entire view that you have of those words. For every communication moment that we have, there's the words that we say, and then the relationship that's affecting those words. So, hello to your teacher is probably going to feel different than hello to your parent or grandparent, or hello to your significant other, or hello to your coworker. Even just that one word is going to be affected by the relationship. And additionally, all of your relationships can affect the content. Next, we have that interpersonal communication can be intentional or unintentional. Intentional messages are sent when the sender wants to send a message. So that's what we typically think about when we think about communication. But sometimes we also send out those unintentional messages, the ones where we don't really mean to say anything or do anything that someone else perceives as a message, but in some way the receiver interprets it as an action that, oh, you meant to say this or you meant to do this. So, for example, if you scratch your head, but your friend thinks that you're waving at them, that would be an unintentional message. Also, consider the fact that interpersonal communication is irreversible. It cannot be changed, repeated, undone. Every single thing, once it's happened, it has now happened. And because it's irreversible, all of our communication will affect our future communication and the quality of our relationships as they move forward. So if you said something mean to a loved one, you know firsthand that communication was irreversible. You can apologize, but you can't take back what you said. It's already been said. And because it's been said, your future communication and the quality of your relationship will now be forever changed by that moment. Okay, so this is going to conclude part 1 of chapter 1. Stay tuned for the part 2.